nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura.
Professor Pertile is Pesco Solido Emeritus Professor of Romance Languages at Harvard and has served as a master of Eliot House for many years before becoming the director of the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance in Florence, the famous Villa Itati. He has published extensively on Dante, on the Tre Corone, and the early history of the novel. His main publications on Dante are La puttana e il gigante, dal Cantico dei Cantici al Paradiso terrestre di Dante. Then he edited a book that I've used extensively, the Cambridge History of Italian Literature. I've used extensively in my courses. But now I would like to point out that together with Rachel Jacob, he is the editor of the forthcoming issue of Forum Italicum on Dante in occasion of the septuagenary. So I'm truly happy for so many reasons to have with us Professor Pertile, and his talk is Midway in the Journey of Our Life. And so I am very happy to leave the floor to Professor Lino Pertile.
Thank you very much for your introduction and for inviting me to talk to your students at Stony Brook. And I have wonderful memories of your university, and I wish I could be there now rather than here in Cambridge, where it seems to be about to rain anyway. Well, before I started, I just wanted to say I've just received my new book. It's entitled Dante Popolare, and I've just got it from the publisher, and so I'm very happy that it is out. The Divine Comedy is, as you well know, a very popular work, but not because we like it so much, but because Dante wrote it in a way that made it popular, and this is what the book tries to show. But today I want to talk about the very beginning of the Divine Comedy, and hence the title, Midway in the Journey of Our Life. Now, the Divine Comedy is the account of a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, which the Florentine poet Dante Alighieri claims to have undertaken by the explicit will of God and through the intercession of his beloved Beatrice, when he was 35 years of age in the year 1300. I'm sure you all know this. The journey, which includes many meetings and conversations between Dante and a significant number of real people, that is, historical people, friends and foes of Dante Alighieri. That journey starts on the night of the Good Friday, 1300, and ends a week later. Thus, it coincides with the liturgical recurrence of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. It leads to the salvation of its protagonist and to the composition of a sacred poem, un poema sacro, whose purpose is the salvation of the whole world. So it is serious stuff. Even apart from the question of credibility, the work broke all the rules, literary, political, religious. Its subject was deeply serious, but its language vernacular, not a language for serious subjects. Its stylistic range was unprecedented, mixing the low and bass with the lofty and abstract, the comic with the tragic, the lyric with the epic, the Christian with the pagan. Politically, it condemned to eternal damnation ecclesiastic as well as secular rulers, and Guelphs as well as Ghibellines, the two factions of a conflict that plagued Tuscany and Italy in the 13th century. Though it favored Florence as a target of its indignation and sarcasm, It spared no city in Tuscany or beyond. Above all, it displayed a profound aversion for the new class of entrepreneur and self-made men who had transformed Florence into a major international center of trade and industry, and who now exercised power over its civil, social, and cultural institutions, its customs and laws, its internal and foreign affairs. Finally, although its theology appeared to be broadly orthodox, the poem was in many ways a veritable scandal. It denounced as unworthy and corrupt popes and cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, calling for the surrender of all the wealth and power the Church had accumulated over 1,000 years. What was worse, indeed intolerable, its author claimed to be a new Christian prophet sent to reform the world before its impending end. How could a decent, intelligent, cultivated Florentine have written anything as subversive as that? Well, you know how this poem begins. Dante places the first canto of the Inferno on the threshold of the story. Now, I often compare it to what you see when you look at a movie that starts before you see the title on the screen, you know, some action. There is some action before the title comes. And this is what Dante does in this way. There is some action before the journey starts. The journey really starts in the third canto, but there is some very interesting action in the first and second canto. Today, I'm going to look at the first canto, which, as you know, begins nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself. I found myself. I discovered myself in a dark forest, per una selva oscura. A dark forest dominates the opening scene of Dante's Inferno, a wild, harsh, menacing forest. And our nameless protagonist, we don't know who is our protagonist, is lost in it. It's a forest that looks like a place and yet feels like a state of mind, a forest that looks real but feels like a nightmare. Our protagonist does not seem to know how he got there. So full of sleep, he says, that he was when he abandoned the straight way. Next thing that he knew, in fact, he says, he found himself in this predicament. He walks on in increasing distress and anxiety, in fear for his life, finding no pathway out until, almost by miracle, he comes to a clearing, and out there, rising before his eyes in the open air, he sees a hill, and over the hill, the sun shining. What a relief. The hill leads upwards, and the sun brings warmth and light. Our traveler's heart stops pounding, and as he walks up towards the hill and the sun, still out of breath, he feels somewhat safe. And like one who has survived the shipwreck, stares back, still in dread of the implacable ocean. He too looks back at the dreaded forest. For a few seconds, the nightmare subsides. As you know, the relief is only temporary. As he begins climbing the hill, aiming towards the sun and the light, out of nowhere, a leopard appears, light and swift, leggera e presta molto, covered with spotted fur, and it does not let him pass. Still, our traveler finds reasons to be hopeful. It's a beautiful spring morning. The sun is shining and the wide open sky is blue. I do know that makes huge difference when you are lost. However, just as he thought he might make it past the leopard, a roaring lion appears in its place, and its presence is so frightful that the air seems to tremble around him. Paria che l'aere ne tremesse. And as though the lion wasn't enough, again suddenly a she-wolf takes shape before his eyes. And she's so lean, so ravenous, so ugly, so aggressive that our traveler is just unable to face her. Thus, that instinct of self-preservation that had driven him upwards towards the sun and up the hill, now that he's faced with a more immediate threat, forces him back down towards the dreaded forest. And indeed, too frightened for words, our traveler gives up the climb and rushes down towards the forest, seeking safety where he knows there can only be ruin. Let's pause a minute. Who's this traveler who says, I? Nel mezzo del cammino della nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Mi ritrovai. I came to myself. I came to myself. Who is this I? And what is the journey, the camin, in the middle of the journey? The camin, the journey, he says that we are in the middle of. What does he mean when he says that he came to himself? Mi ritrovai. Well, I want to look at this. 2 or 3 things that it seems are essential for us to understand what is really going on. Who is I? I is both the character, the protagonist, and the narrator. The character and the narrator at the same time. It is the narrator who has survived this adventure and is now in the process of telling it in writing, of writing it down. The same person, both protagonist and narrator. Now, unlike Homer and unlike Virgil, who always in their poems say he, never I. And unlike Ulysses, if you want, in the Odyssey, and Aeneas in the Aeneid, who go to hell but do not write the stories of their journey, the protagonist and narrator of the Divine Comedy are one and the same person. A poet, a Florentine poet, simultaneously at 2 different stages of his life. The stage of actual experience, the stage of the journey, and the stage of reliving that experience through the retelling of it. In Purgatorio, Canto 30, line 55-57, we will see that this character narrator is called Dante. Beatrice would actually call him by name, Dante, perché Virgilio se ne vada, non piange tanto, non piange ancora, etc. Dante, she calls him. Indeed, the poet Dante Alighieri makes sure that we readers realize that the narrator and the protagonist of the Divine Comedy is Dante Alighieri himself. A Florentine by birth, but not by customs, as he signs himself. Dante Alighieri himself gone on a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise during the Easter week of the year 1300. That is to say that Dante presents a real journey, presents to us a real journey, not just a dream, not just poetic fiction. He presents the journey as a real experience. Clearly, the character Dante, the narrator Dante, and the historical person known as Dante Alighieri are all intertwined and largely overlapping. But we cannot assume that they are one. They are not three either. They are not three discrete entities. It is ultimately an irresolvable ambiguity, and Dante fully exploits it. So this is I. I is more than, in a sense, one character. It is one character, but it is also the character of the narrator. We can talk about that later if you're interested. But because now I really want to tell you more about the journey. Il cammino. Dante does not say midway in the journey of my life, but of our life. We could paraphrase this line as follows: in the middle of the journey, that is our life. This sentence denotes a point in time and one in space. The issue of time is easily resolved. The accepted ordinary duration of individual life in Dante's culture was 70 years. Not very different from what we think. 70 years. Therefore, in the middle of our life means when I was 35. That is in the year 1300, because Dante was born in 1265. 1300 happens to be also the year of the first Jubilee, that is, the first holy year that the church celebrated. And the time in which Dante believed that the church was led by an unworthy pope, Boniface VIII, while the empire had no leader at all. Thus, a time of crisis, not only for the protagonist of the journey, but also for what Dante thought was the entire world. So, you see, the condition of the character Dante, who is lost, is really a mirror of the condition in which the world itself is lost. The issue, let's move on. The issue of space is more complicated. For the journey of our life is a journey only in a metaphorical sense. This metaphor, however, is one which in Christian culture defines the most intrinsic meaning of human life, the essence of human existence. Quite simply, life is understood to be a journey. More precisely, a journey back home. Life is a state of exile in a land that originally was not meant for us. In this alien land, in this region of unlikeness, we are travelers, pilgrims on our way home. And the desire for fulfillment we feel is the sign of a profound homesickness, the pain for our return to a home we don't know, our lost paradise. So you see, from the very beginning of Dante's poem, you come across this notion that journey, exile, home, pilgrim, desire. For Dante, these are not just metaphors, but a cluster of notions that capture and define the essence of the human condition. What life is all about. Exile is the existential state of the pilgrim people longing for home. To use a biblical image, we are Israel in Egypto, the people yearning for their homeland. But when and how did our exile begin? I'm sure you know, but let me repeat it for you because I like this story. According to Christian beliefs, our exile began in the Garden of Eden. The place that is the most direct antithesis, the most opposite archetype, if you will, of the dark forest. This is really the foundational myth of Judeo-Christian culture and religion. And you know the story. Adam and Eve lived naked, happy and free in the Garden of Eden. No work, no pain, no death troubled them at all. Only one thing they were not allowed to do. They were not allowed, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. This is what God told them. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so Eve was tempted, and she gave in to temptation. She took of the fruit of the tree and ate of it. And she also gave some to her husband Adam, who was with her, and he ate it too. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. And here there is the beautiful vision of the Lord God going about the garden, in the evening breeze. And Adam and Eve are hidden away. And the Lord called to Adam and said to him, where are you? And Adam, oh, I heard that sound of you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? The woman gave it to me. And Eve, and the serpent tempted me. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. And to the woman, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, etc., etc. And to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten of the tree, cursed is the ground. Because of you, in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, and you are dust, and to dust. God drove out the man and his wife. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. That is how it all began. That is how our exile began. And with our exile, time and history began too. Since then, humanity has been striving in 1,000 different ways to go back to the Garden of Eden, to roll back time and recover its lost innocence. Unfortunately, knowledge cannot be undone, and innocence cannot be regained except through knowledge itself, a knowledge that one acquires by dying to the world and going down, which is precisely what Dante the character does, following the example of Jesus Christ, who dies as a man to redeem humanity. And that's why Dante's proper journey back starts only after his resurfacing, his resurrection, as it were, on the shore of Mount Purgatory. Because first Dante goes down, he goes inside the earth. Only after going through the earth Dante finds the sight of the sky again. In this light, Dante's journey is exemplary. It is every man's journey. It is meant to be our journey from darkness to light, from sin to innocence, from exile home. And in this sense, it is a comedy because it starts badly, but it ends well. It starts with fear of death and ends in sight of eternal bliss. Well, back to the first line. The journey in the middle of which Dante wakes up at the beginning of Inferno is this metaphorical journey. And as all journeys in space, this journey too takes time, and Dante is careful to register the passing of days and nights, the coming of dusk and dawn. Indeed, the information he gives us is unambiguous. His journey through hell starts on the evening of Good Friday. He reaches the mountain of purgatory just before dawn on Easter Sunday, and the first heaven of paradise at noon on Wednesday after Easter. The coincidence whereby the time Dante spends underground corresponds exactly to the time that Christ spends in his tomb, from his burial to his resurrection, is obviously not fortuitous. When he steps onto hell, Dante symbolically dies, and he returns to life at dawn on Easter Sunday, when he emerges again on the surface of the earth. But there is something else that intrigues us about these notions of home and exile, something that connects them most compellingly with the birth of Dante's great poem. Dante Alighieri was actually in exile from his home city of Florence when he wrote the comedy. And it is to this double exile from heaven and from Florence that we owe the poem, the comedy. Dante was banished from Florence at the end of January 1302, and finding himself already out of the city, he never returned home. When he died in Ravenna 20 years later, September 1321, having just completed the Divine Comedy, his body was laid to rest there. The poem was probably conceived, at least in its initial stages, as a passport back to Florence, his home. So a concrete passport back to home, to Florence. The creation of the poem was therefore, in a real sense, the result of his author's exile. Having been banished from active politics, Dante resorted to poetry as a surrogate, or, if you will, as a way to sublimate a desire to change the world that was totally frustrated by the reality of Dante's life. Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. I came to myself, he writes. The use of the past tense, I came to myself, obliges us to visualize as simultaneous the present of the character and the present of the narrator, the journey and its telling. Dante is the hero who has survived to tell the tale. Throughout the story, he knows much more than us, until we too reach the end of his journey, where character and narrator merge again into one. At that point, if we start reading the poem for a second time, as we should, we begin to see how character and narrator interact. The poem has this circularity, whereby certain episodes acquire their full meaning only when we read the story a second time around, when we too acquire the same experience as the narrator. I found myself in a dark forest. Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. What is this forest? And what is the meaning of this coming to himself, this finding of himself? The forest is, first of all, a forest, but also an archetype of what? Of chaos, disorder, confusion, darkness, the unknown and the hostile, the mysterious and frightful, the monstrous, a nightmare, if you will, that causes anguish, fear, dread. This is where Dante suddenly wakes up at the beginning of the story. But the awakening is crucial. This coming to himself of our protagonist is the awakening of consciousness, the realization that he is lost, a realization that is indispensable for the traveler to find the right way again. Dante realizes who he is and where he is. What or who prompts this feeling? This is the real question at this point. Dante does not say so. Who wakes him up? What wakes him up? Dante does not say so, but we understand. And the story soon confirms that it is a special grace which opens his eyes, allowing him to see the shapeless forest of confusion and disorder that encircles him. There is a beautiful song in the American tradition that is sung very often and that summarizes or represents this situation incredibly well. And you all know it. And the song is Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. This is the state of mind and the emotional state in which Dante finds himself at the beginning of his journey. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, says the song, I have already come. It is grace. Grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. It's an extraordinary thing. What Dante is up, you see, he's up to is something that we are supposed to be very familiar with. Dante too finds himself only when he realizes that he is lost. He finds that he is lost, he sees that he is blind. It is a moment of conversion, as John Fleccero calls it. A topographical notion, the forest, turns moral. The landscape of the material world turns into a psychological map of the human soul. However, Dante is no mystic. Amazing Grace has a narrative phase. The gods of Homer, you remember, discuss the fate of men and women on Mount Olympus, and from there they initiate our movements on earth. Likewise, the Divine Comedy, as we will see in Canto 2, 3 blessed ladies from heaven arrange for Dante's rescue from the forest. They are those 3 blessed ladies who are, in a sense, the agent of grace, the agents of grace. But the rescue is only a beginning. Full freedom and redemption will require a much longer process, a process of which Dante himself will be responsible. The character narrator is facing something which does not yet exist, and only he can realize the writing of the poem. And in fact, Dante immediately said so. Ai quanto a dir qual era e cosa dura esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte che nel pensier rinnova la paura. How hard it is to tell what it was like, that wood, that forest, savage, dense, and harsh. The very thought of it renews my fear. You see, there is the memory of that fear, but there is also the challenge of actually expressing that fear in words, the challenge of writing the poem about it. From the very beginning of the poem, Dante tells us not just how hard the experience of the journey was, but how difficult it is now to tell the story of that experience. And Dante comes out of the forest and begins climbing the hill, going straight to the light of the sun. When three beasts appear blocking his way up, perhaps they are not three, but just one, which, as is often the case in medieval tales, changes its shape from a leopard to a lion to a she-wolf. In any case, in this moral landscape, these three creatures are more meaningful than they might seem at first glance. Generations of readers have identified the leopard as lust, the lion as pride, and the she-wolf as greed. The forest, the straight way, the hill, the sun, the three beasts. Is the Divine Comedy an allegorical poem then, you might ask? Well, it is and it isn't. Be this as it may, the protagonist of our story is rushing back towards the forest in a state of despair. He has exhausted all his personal resources. The bonds that hold him prisoner deprive him also of the minimum knowledge necessary for him to loosen them and find his freedom. Only an external agent can now save him. So you see the situation is that Dante is caught between the three beasts and the forest now. And there is nothing else he can do about it. This is where the second half of the first canto begins, from line 61. As Dante is falling back into the dreaded forest, suddenly the figure of a man appears in the desert. Miserere di me, qualche tu sio, od ombra od homo certo. Dante shouts, have mercy on me, whatever you are, whether shade or living man. This is a remarkable turning point in the poem and in the history of Western literature. The figure is that of a true person, historical person, though dead, and he speaks fully declaring his historical identity. Non homo, già fui, e I parenti miei furo Lombardi. And it's an extraordinary thing, because I've just said that we were looking at a forest and a she-wolf, the leopard and the lion, and the journey. All this was allegorical. Perhaps it was allegorical or real. We don't know. And then suddenly you have this historical character. Non homo già fui, e I parenti miei furo Lombardi. Not a man, but a man I once was, and my parents came from Lombardy. And he goes on to specify that the place and time of his birth, the country of his parents, the name of the Roman emperor whose subject he was, and what skill he practiced while he was alive. As a result of this self-introduction, we are left with no doubt at all. This soul who has appeared to Dante as a shadow of his historical self is the Latin poet Virgil. Virgil, appearing out of nowhere in this no man's land over 13 centuries after his death. Virgil, son of Mantuans, who was born under Caesar and lived under Augustus. Virgil, the venerated poet of the Aeneid, the Georgics and the Bucolics, Dante's own model poet and master of wisdom. The forest, the hill, the beasts, the sun may be allegories, but Virgil is Virgil, and he says as much. I am Virgil. It is then a poet like Virgil who comes to rescue Dante, not a philosopher like Aristotle, or a theologian like St. Thomas, not even a saint like St. Augustine, or an angel from heaven, but Virgil, the poet of the Roman Empire, a pagan, not a Christian, a pagan. comes to the rescue of a Christian. A pagan poet whose poetry, as we will see, is so powerful that it can save others, though not its author. Dante the character is as amazed as we are. Or sei tu quel Virgilio e quella fonte che spandi di parlarsi largo fiume. Are you then, Virgil, the fountainhead that pours a full stream of speech, si largo fiume? Di parlare, such a wide river of speech, of words. O degli altri poeti onore e lume, vagliami il lungo studio e il grande amore che m'ha fatto cercar lo tuo volume. Tu sei lo mio maestro, il mio autore, tu sei solo colui da cui io tolsi lo bello stile che m'ha fatto onore. O glory and light of all other poets, let my long study and great love avail that made me delve so deep into your volume. You are my teacher and my author. You are the one from whom alone I took the noble style that has brought me honor. Dante is stunned and then ecstatic and overwhelmed at the sight of his model poet. His enthusiasm is hardly exaggerated. Virgil was the most beloved and venerated poet of the Middle Ages. He enters the poem here in the first canto of Inferno and remains on center stage for 2/3 of the poem until he and Dante reach earthly paradise at the end of Purgatorio. His function is twofold. On the level of the journey, the Roman poet guides Dante towards freedom and salvation, while offering him a living foil. On the level of the narration itself, he provides him with an almost sacred model of poetic accomplishment. Eventually, however, Virgil the sage will be unable to follow his Christian charge. Likewise, Virgil the poet will be not merely equaled, but emulated and arguably surpassed by Dante. The relationship between the two characters is engrossing. In the fiction of the poem, of the story, Dante is the disciple, the pupil, and Virgil, the master and leader. In truth, the acknowledgement of the master's greatness is constantly undermined by the greatness of the pupil's acknowledgement. For example, look at what Dante says to Virgil. Vedi la bestia per cui mi volsi, aiutami da lei, famoso saggio, che ella mi fa tremar le vene e i polsi. Ella mi fa tremar le vene e i polsi. See the beast that forced me to turn back. Save me from her, famous sage. She makes my veins and pulses tremble. Even in the very moment that Dante pleads for help from the fierce she-wolf, he's able to show off his poetical skill. See how realistic and concrete is the description of Dante's fear of the she-wolf. She makes my veins and pulses tremble in my body. Poetry of things, not of words. Virgil replies, inviting Dante to cease trying to go up the hill and follow instead a different path, a different journey. Paradoxically and terrifyingly, a way downward into the darkness. The pagan poet will guide our lost traveler through the eternal place, out of the predicament he got himself into. Dante will need to go down in order to go up, to die in order to be born again. More astonishingly, the Roman Virgil speaks first about the she-wolf, which is Dante's own poetic creation. Virgil does not ease Dante's terror by telling him that it's just an hallucination, a nightmare, a figment of his imagination. Rather, he confirms that the she-wolf is a living and true beast, invincible to all except to a mysterious Veltro, a greyhound, who one day, we don't know when, will come to make her die in pain, indeed to drive her back to hell, whence envy first released her. And in so doing, Virgil adds, the greyhound will bring salvation not only to a poor lost traveler like Dante, but to the whole of Italy. Salvation to the whole of Italy, for which the Virgin Camilla, Euryalus, Turnus, and Nisus died of their wounds, says Virgil. This is another blow for the modern reader. What is Dante doing? What is he up to? First, look, Camilla, Euryalus, Turnus, and Nisus are totally legendary characters of Virgil's Aeneid. But Virgil mentions them as historical martyrs of the Italian nation, thus mixing history and fiction in a most bewildering fashion. Second thing, what's Italy got to do with Dante's personal crisis? And how can Virgil be both the poet of the Roman Empire who died in the year 19 BC and the prophet of the Italian redemption in the year 1300? We thought that just Dante was astray in the dark forest. Now we begin to see that Italy and the whole world are lost with him. We are confronted with levels of discourse that on the surface appear utterly disjointed. Yet the poem will show the continuity between the Roman Empire and the present time, as it will show that Dante's personal crisis is but a facet of the moral and political crisis that engulfs Florence, Rome, the empire, and the world in the year 1300. Well, Dante has not yet begun his journey, but the reader is at once fascinated and disoriented. Facing a rich and complex poetic texture that involves vision and reality, myth and fact, allegory and prophecy, personal experience and universal history, the redemption of one man and the salvation of the human race. The end of the canto announces the beginning of the journey, as I said at the very beginning, the beginning of the journey, the beginning of the movie, the story, a movement forward in which Virgil leads and Dante follows. And here, in fact, it ends. The first canto ends with a beginning. Allor si mosse e io ti tenni dietro. And he moved on, and I followed him. Dante's journey begins now. Thank you. Here I end my story.
Thank you very much. And your end is our beginning. Thank you very much. Brilliant. The conclusion is, in fact, a great note on the fact that Dante ends, as you said, Dante ends the first canto with the beginning, and it begins the first canto with the end, because the pilgrim is
lost. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yes, this is why it is such a great pleasure to read this work. It's amazing. I invite our audience, the students specifically, to take the floor, but even the guests, if they will, to give time to everybody to write their questions in the chat, as it is customary. I will start and break the ice, and I will ask you a question that hopefully echoes what you have said earlier, saying that the poet and the narrator of the Divine Comedy are the same person in two different stages of his life, of their life. And in fact, the fact that the poem happens in the liturgical recurrence of Christ's death and resurrection in the Holy Week of the Holy Year 1300, right, indicates that the pilgrim is a figura Christi, that he is reinterpreting the steps of Christ. And indeed, the name itself of the pilgrim by which we designate him represents the figure of Christ, the walker who went through the experience of being man. I was thinking that if we follow until the end of this dichotomy, it would be tempting to say that Dante, the author, then, is a figura of God, that the author is the omniscient author, the one who knows the beginning and the end, the one for whom the volume is always accessible at the same time, i.e. the eternal present. And I wonder if you would yield to such temptation or would try to resist it. And as a side note, I noticed that at a certain point you said the author is two people, the same person in two different moments, but not three. And that was just a remark, but I wish if you could expand a little bit on that as well.
Well, thank you. This is a wonderful knot of questions. We could have certainly spent the rest of the day beginning our discussion. But first of all, you are absolutely right that Dante is a figura Christi. And at first, when we think about it, we think that it is very presumptuous on Dante's part to present himself in this way. But on the other hand, if you think a bit longer about it, then you understand that each one of us is a figura Christi. You see what I mean? It's part of the Christian view of life that each one of us should be a figura Christi, and that we should follow that particular example. So really, there is nothing exceptional about it. In the case of Dante, the exception is the fact that his journey, in a sense, seems to be based on Christ's final journey from earth to heaven through death, and Dante dies by going, and then so there is this kind of likeness that is, if you think about it, it's not disturbing because it is really supposed to be the way in which all human beings achieve the end of the journey. They achieve the purpose of their life by actually achieving the eternal bliss, the blessedness of paradise. So yeah, I want to make this clear that on the one hand, it sounds exceptional. On the other hand, Dante enacts a notion that is fundamental to the Christian view of the world, the Christian view of life. It's so fundamental that, in fact, as I showed before, it's really, this is what that song, Amazing Grace, is about. This is what it is. That song is about that. So these notions of exile and home are these metaphors are really standard notions in the vocabulary of the Christian faith. The other point that the two or three is an extremely interesting and at the same time a somewhat difficult point. But to make it very simple, we have at the very beginning of the Divine Comedy, when Dante says, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai. Okay, we have really three Dantes, not two. Why three? One is the character who is involved in doing the journey. So this is Dante the Pilgrim, is known in English in Dante studies in English. It is known as Dante the Pilgrim. Then there is Dante the narrator, who tells the story, the experience that the pilgrim has done. Now this narrator, okay, is number two. And but this narrator is not the same as Dante Alighieri, the man. Because if you say that it is the same, then you take it, then you think that Dante the man is gone to Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. You see, so Dante, in a sense, is building two characters at the same time. The character of the traveler, the pilgrim, and that of the narrator who tells the story. Narrator and pilgrim become one at the very end of the poem, when the poem ends. But as soon as you start reading it again, there are two. They are both creation of what? Of Dante the poet, Dante Alighieri, who is a historical person, born in 1265, died 1321, 700 years ago. So there is the distinction should be made between these three different functions, and two of them are in a sense fictional and one is real. One is Dante, the historical character, and the other two are two fictional functions. I think that critics on Danteisti, the Dante scholars, have made too much of this, and they talk about Dante, the character growing, becoming through these experiences and so on, which I actually don't buy. I mean, I don't agree with that. But the distinction, however, is there. The distinction is there. But Dante insists all the time that it's more important than the distinction for Dante is that we accept this notion that Dante Alighieri, is the protagonist of that particular story, and that it is only one notion, that is one function that is that we should remember. As Charles Singleton famously said, the fiction of the comedy is that it is not a fiction. All right, which sounds wonderful, but it is true, of course, of all fiction. If you think about it, when you read a novel, the novel does not tell you that it is a fiction. The fiction of the novel is that it is not a fiction, and this is what we find so engrossing. So let's put it this way: if we want to be very analytical, we can say yes, there are three Dantes: the character, the narrator, and the historical Dante. Okay, yes, okay, there are. At the same time, Dante is one only, and you can say that this is, and that you can say that the Divine Comedy is a powerfully autobiographical piece of writing. And when we say that any piece of writing is autobiographical, we mean to say that the author and the character of the story are really or share a great deal in common, have a great deal in common. I don't know if this has answered your question.
Thank you very much. It does beautifully. I will then open the floor, and I will invite Gabriella if you would like to read your question for Professor Pertile.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I have a question that's partially been answered, I believe, but I will ask again because it is twofold. So you stated that this piece leads to the salvation of humanity, which is undeniable. However, I can't seem to understand why Dante the poet chose to leave certain characters in purgatory, such as Virgil and those who had passed before the time of Jesus Christ. So would you agree that the entire work is simply his description of the universal struggle that is life rather than the afterlife? And I also had a third part to this question. Would you also, because I know you were saying that you don't really buy what scholars are saying in regards to this piece being about the universal journey of life. However, nowhere in the comedy is it made clear that Dante experiences death. So that's why I considered that this is kind of, it takes place in the afterlife, but I don't actually buy that this is about to the afterlife.
Yeah, well, I think that your observation is correct. It's the setting is certainly the afterlife. There's no question about it, and there is a tradition for this in European literature, European culture. As you know, journeys or visions of the afterlife were not unknown. You know, they exist in Islamic tradition as well as in Christian tradition. You know, Muhammad went and did a very similar journey. So there is not a great, nothing is from that point of view terribly original. What is original about Dante is that what he finds in his exploration of the afterlife is what he believes to be the results of the way in which people live in this life, so as you put it. So by exploring the afterlife, we actually learn much, much, much more about this life than we could learn by looking at this life blindly. Because there we discover what? The motivations behind people's actions. You know, and we know whether they were good or bad, because God sees into people's consciousness, and therefore you have the case Canto 27 of Guido da Montefeltro, who thought he was going to be saved. He thought the angel was coming for him. No, he said St. Francis was coming for me. St. Francis, you know, was a notorious naive saint. And he didn't realize, St. Francis, that he had committed a very, very, very serious sin, that he had confessed before, actually, that he thought he had been absolved of a sin before actually he committed it. You know, and something that cannot be done. And in fact, he goes to hell. So what is, yes, so by exploring the afterlife, Dante tells us much, much more than had ever been told before him about this life. The good and bad of this life. What is good and bad. About, you know, the vices and virtues of this life. So yes, there is no poem that is more explicit in many ways about the author's view of the world of philosophy and beliefs than the Divine Comedy. And so, on the one hand, the comedy satisfies this curiosity that we still have, about what might happen to us after our death. It satisfies that. On the other hand, it really tells us something constant about, and very profound about human relationships. Basically, the way in which we interact with other people, and if our interaction is good, if it is kind, if it is if it is full of love for our neighbors, then we end up in paradise. Otherwise, of course, the chances are, unless we repent at the very last minute, we end up in hell. I don't know whether this is a commentary on what you said rather than answer to your question, because I think you seem to have known this already. But is there something that I have left out?
Yes. So, given your rationale, why would you think that Dante left Virgil in purgatory? Because it's like he didn't.
Oh, really, yeah. That is a very hard question. Dante, it would have been easier for Dante to save Virgil than not, because Virgil had a pretty good name in the Middle Ages. And it would have been easier for him to say that Virgil had seen the light before dying. But in my opinion, Virgil is too involved and too compromised, if you want, with gli dei falsi bugiardi, how Dante puts it, the false and lying gods of pre-Christian gods, for him to be saved. And so Virgil is half saved and half damned, because he's not really in hell, he's in limbo, where he doesn't see God, but on the other hand, he's not physically punished. So he's half saved. Yeah, it's the question that you are asking, however, is a much bigger question that Dante will face up in Paradise, Canto 19, 21 in particular. These are the cantos. The question is the question of the salvation of the non-believers, the non-Christian. How this is really a question that is. Dante does something that seems to be understandable. He creates exceptions. There is one exception, that is the exception of a Trojan hero. A Trojan hero, forgot his name, sorry. Trojan hero. It's my, see, I'm getting old, so my mind I got this name. Anyway, Dante invents a way in which he thinks that some non-believers were given a chance to believe by being brought back to life, become Christian again, and die a Christian. Therefore, you find them in paradise rather than finding them anywhere in hell or in limbo or other parts of the world. In the case of the this Trojan, Justissimus Ille, he calls it. The Virgil calls it, but you have to forgive me that at the moment the name doesn't come back.
You're talking of Aeneas?
Sorry?
Talking of Aeneas.
No, it's not Aeneas. No, it's not Aeneas. Not Aeneas. Aeneas is in limbo. No, it will come back. It will come to me. It's one of these moments. That exception proves what? It proves that it is possible, that God's justice is inscrutable, and therefore God can save the good people, even if they are not Christian, even if they are not born after Christ. You see what I mean? So Dante does create these exceptions, and we can say that this opens the door for the non-believers, the good non-believers. So Dante does two things. He condemns a lot of believers, but he also leaves the door open for non-believers to be saved. Though Dante makes it very clear that in order to be saved, you have to be baptized, you have to become a Christian. And there are ways in which it seems that God's providence is able to achieve that, even when we don't know, we are not aware of it happening. Finally, there is something that Dante says in Canto 19, Canto 21. Dante tells us that this is not something that we should delve into too much. We should not presume to know how God's justice operates. All right. So, in other words, Dante tells us that we should have faith in God's justice, and by that implying that the good will be saved and the bad will be damned. This is what Dante seems to imply in those cantos of Paradiso. But it is, as I mentioned, for us, it's strange to find a mixture of historical character, say Caesar, Aristotle, and totally mythical characters in Limbo. In Limbo, you don't find just Virgil, who is a historical character. In Limbo, you find Camilla, you find Aurelio, you find Nisus. They are characters of Virgil's poem. It was so. We could ask ourselves, but then did Dante believe that these were real people, historical people? Didn't Dante make a distinction between historical and legendary and fictional? Well, I don't know to what extent he did. It's really, no, there are things that we are not so sure about. Did Dante believe in the Bible? Did he believe that actually the Adam and Eve lived in earthly paradise, and that the story of the Genesis that I read was a true story and not an allegory? We don't know. We don't know. See, so that is, but Dante said that in general that does seem to imply or to that yes, the good will be saved, regardless of where they are found, the color of their skin, or where they live in the Indo, as it says. Dante specifically speaks about India. All right.
Thank you. I wonder if we'll have time for a little more questions. Then I think you were talking about Ripheus.
About
Ripheus in the sphere of Jupiter.
Ripheus. Oh, yes, of course. Thank you.
Anastasia, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Professor Pertile, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the conversion that you were talking about that Dante undergoes in this canto. I never thought about it that way, so I'd be really interested to hear more about it.
Yeah. Well, you can talk in terms of conversion, really physical conversion, because he is on the, no, la dritta via era smarrita. So the straight way was lost. And so Dante has to converge, he has to move back to the via, to the dritta via. And so there is that kind of almost physical journey that he must accomplish. And he has to go back to, you could say that he finds the correct way when he steps onto the shore of Mount Purgatory. Right. And the experience of hell is the experience that he has to go through in order to find his way again. And there is some kind of very suggestive reality about this. If you have found, if you ever found yourself lost in a way, especially if you are lost in the middle of the wood or something like that, or in a city that you don't know, it's a very, it's a bit frightening, and you are frightened, and your heart sort of beats more than usually while you are looking to find your way, your true way, the real way, when you are moving back towards the real way. So there is this conversion that is physical, but there is also a conversion that is of a different nature, of course, that is of a spiritual nature. So the spiritual is that Dante is going back into the journey that he is supposed to be undertaking. That he is finding the ability to see what he had lost before. And indeed, it's to find the straight path towards his own salvation. It's this, what it is this mixture of, let's say, a topographical notion and a psychological, spiritual notion. And the word conversion is good because it can be used both to describe a movement, a physical movement, but also to describe a spiritual movement. When we say that the person is converted to Christianity or Catholicism, what do we really mean? We mean that this person has left the ways that he or she was pursuing or following before, and has moved towards a different type of itinerary, different type of course. So this is what the conversion is. It's a change of mind, a change of feeling, a change that occurs in your spirituality, in your own soul. This is the conversion. So Dante is converted when he, in a sense, he's converted physically with the help of Virgil. Virgil guides him back to the right way. And there is almost a ritual at the end of the climb of Purgatorio where Dante becomes the completely in charge of himself, and Virgil lets him go. Virgil can be looked upon as a symbol of reason, the rational power that will allow us to live rationally, not like beasts. But it's not enough. It's enough for Dante to find back his way, and then he's got to go further than that if he wants to go to heaven. So it's a conversion, but also a journey that takes him back to the end of, to the ultimate, I would say, destination that, according to the Christian religion, we should all look forward to. So this is the conversion. It's a psychological, spiritual process, but also a topographical, geographical process that is beautifully expressed and described by Dante through you can say that the whole of Inferno, the whole of Purgatorio is part of this big conversion of Dante towards what? Towards the ultimate bliss.
Thank you. In order to spare our guest, we will take just one more question, and hold on to your questions, which are many and very interesting, and I promise that we will discuss them together in class. But in order to conclude our session, I would ask, please, Eric Spalding, to propose a question. Eric, the floor is yours. Eric? Yeah.
Yes. So my question was, when it came to, I found it interesting when you said that our pursuit of paradise is kind of related to the same feeling as homesickness. And I was wondering if this sense of this feeling of homesickness is what Dante is suggesting that drives humans to sin, that the innate like feeling to fulfill this kind of gap in us, this homesickness that we're feeling because we're separated from paradise, is pretty much, is that what drives humans to sin according to Dante?
Yeah, you were absolutely right. Yes, we make this mistake, according to Dante, but not only Dante, of believing that material goods will give us that satisfaction, that fulfillment that we are looking for. Okay? And therefore we try to get them, to possess them, to make them ours. This be money, power, or whatever, right? But then we discover that it's not enough. We want more and more and more. Why? Because, as St. Augustine puts it, we were made for you, he says, and our soul will be restless, will not rest until we rest in you. As he said, donec requiescat in te. And St. Paul makes it very clear. Here he says, this is only a temporary home, says St. Paul. The world, the experience of this world is just, we are on a journey. And during this, the experience of the journey, we are seeking a permanent home, futuram civitatem, the ultimate homeland. This is what we are after here. And so now if you transfer this onto Dante, you will see that Dante will actually articulate this notion in different ways with different characters that he meets in Inferno or Purgatory and so on. But you will see this repeated time and again. You will see human beings making the mistake of believing that the material goods or the material satisfaction will provide them with the joy, the fulfillment they are after. that they're all being bitterly disappointed and end up through ignorance, or very often through this unwillingness to believe, they will end up in hell rather than paradise. Yes, but so the answer that your question is yes. This is a pattern, if you want, that is enacted in Dante's comedy, in Dante's Divine Comedy, time and again throughout. You can say the whole poem, and you could say that if you believe in this notion, it is a pattern that each one of us enacts in his or her life. But thank you for the question. It's a very, very good one. It goes to the very heart of the Divine Comedy, but also the very heart of the notion of Christian life.
And thank you, Professor Pertile, for the answer. Thank you very much for being with us. We are
sure. I hope to come and see you in persona.
It will happen. We'll make it happen from next fall. In fact, I'll take you at your word, and we will be invited for the fall. Thank you very much. So thank you all for being with us.
Thank you all for listening to me, and all the best.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.